Greetings, everybody. This is Christopher Messina coming at you from the Messy Time Studios on June 10th, 2025, broadcasting as ever from the beaches of the last free state in America, Florida. Joining me from a bit up the coast in Virginia is John Kiriakou, who some of you may already have heard of, who is a former CIA agent who sadly went to prison for whistleblowing on the government's illegal torture of foreigners. I will leave that as a quick intro and say, John, thank you so much for taking the time to come on. I'll put all the links to your books and the rest of the intro.
Thank you.
But
my pleasure.
Love to hear a chat. Love to hear a little bit more about your story for those who haven't heard it.
Thanks. Well, yeah, I spent almost 15 years at the CIA. The first half of my career was in analysis, specifically Iraq. The second half was in counterterrorism operations. I was the chief of CIA counterterrorism ops in Pakistan after 9/11. Led a series of raids that resulted in the capture of, among other people, Abu Zubaydah, whom we believed at the time was the number 3 in Al-Qaeda. And later blew the whistle on the CIA's torture program. Abu Zubaydah was the first high-value target with which, or who was subjected to the CIA's torture techniques. And after I blew the whistle, before I was prosecuted by the Obama administration, I was the senior investigator on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, looking at things like international piracy, drug trafficking, and terrorism. But then the government fell on my head. I went to prison for 2 years and came out completely unrepentant. And I don't know, people since then have called me a journalist. I've never called myself a journalist. I call myself a writer. I have a couple of syndicated columns. I just published, in 2 weeks, my 8th book is going to be published. I'm halfway done with my 9th right now. And I teach, I lecture, I give talks, et cetera, et cetera.
Awesome. Well, here's the question I had hearing your story, right? Having survived September 11th in Lower Manhattan, which was the 4th time Islamic terrorists had tried to blow me up in the previous 5 years. So I'd had 3 near misses, 1 in North Africa, 2 in South Africa prior to that. And trying to maintain humor in dark times. When I finally got back home to Brooklyn Heights, where my wife and I reconnected, I said, this is starting to feel personal.
Yeah.
So you got to feel a little bit of humor now and again. My question would be, given having lived through that and having, watched outrages since then, always in the private sector, but have worked in national security from the private sector side of the world. I think everyone thinks, or actually don't, like I said, I personally would think that I would welcome wreaking vengeance on those who had done such harm to my country and my loved ones and trying to do harm to myself. So what was the motivation? Because I don't know if in your position, I would have blown the whistle, right? So I'm kind of curious, like, what was the motivation for, we've got this demonstrably evil prick in custody and we want to know something from him and we're doing horrible, mean things to him to make that happen. But clearly that was a line of morality that you thought was, well, I'm not actually going to guess. What was the thing that motivated you to say, this is wrong, and I'm going to blow the whistle?
Well, the motivation was the Constitution. On my very first day at the CIA, I stood there with 300 other people with my right hand in the air, and I swore to uphold and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And I meant it. We're supposed to be a nation of laws. We're supposed to be a nation that respects the rule of law and the Constitution. And by God, if we don't, then how can we judge ourselves to be any better than they are? And so I took that very, very seriously, very seriously.
And what do you think or if you have an opinion, the motivations of those on the other side of that equation who are in the position to breach the Constitution, basically, in the hopes of getting something actionable out of it? What do you think went through their minds? The same people who took the same oath,
sure,
decided they felt comfortable morally this was in
because they believed that desperate times called for desperate measures. And they believed deep down we're the good guys. And if we're the good guys, then we can do what we want to do. And that's besides the fact that torture has been 100% proven to not work. The prisoner will tell you anything he thinks you want to hear just to get you to stop torturing him. It just doesn't work. And then you tie up teams of analysts for months pouring through all this garbage to see what's true and what's not true. And in the end, it's just a waste of time and resources. But I know these guys. I know them very well, knew them very well. They were all, patriotic Americans. But they let their emotions get the best of them. And I'll give you a more specific example, or maybe not even an example, but an analysis. In 1945, just after the end of the Second World War, we executed Japanese soldiers who waterboarded American POWs. Congress had passed a law, that was in 45 and 46. Congress passed a law in 45 called the National Torture Act, which specifically banned exactly those techniques that the CIA used later. That was 1945, 1946. In January of 1968, the Washington Post ran a front page photograph of an American soldier waterboarding a North Vietnamese prisoner. On the day that picture was published, Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, ordered an investigation. The soldier was arrested. He was convicted of torture and sentenced to 20 years of hard labor at Fort Leavenworth. Well, the law never changed. It was never repealed. It was never amended. Congress took no action. And in 2002, like magic, it's all legal just because we say it is.
Right.
And sorry, but I'm not buying it. Either we're a nation of laws or we're not a nation of laws. And if you want to torture people, and this is something that reasonable people can agree to disagree on, but if you want to torture somebody, you got to change the law. Have the guts to go to Capitol Hill and say, I want permission to torture people. And they didn't have the guts to do it.
Well, the same argument could well be made, and many have, that until Congress, empowered by the Constitution, declares war.
Exactly.
How are we sending troops to another country to fight?
It is an impeachable offense every time a president, any president, sends combat troops overseas. You are exactly right.
Which means, and the last time we declared war was
December 8th,
World War II?
December 8th, 1941. The day after Pearl Harbor.
Right. So everything since then has been a police action or an intervention,
a conflict,
or a whatever.
Yeah. The Korean conflict.
Every single action.
Yeah. Vietnam was a police action. Yeah. Grenada was an intervention. Sure.
And Afghanistan and Iraq for 20 years.
Congress never declared war on anybody.
It's what kills me about a lot of this. I'm curious about your thoughts because you were serving. Is that I sit on the board of the Combat Control Foundation. I've done a lot of work over the years at the intersection of military and intelligence because I work in natural resources around the world. So there are lots of places where it's really prudent for private sector executives to inform the embassy where they're going to be.
That's exactly right.
There's an old buddy of mine I went to college with who went into the Marines. We were graduating. He went right into the Marines, and I was heading into business. He said, remember, just always tell us where you are. We'll come get you.
It's true. It's true.
We like coming to get you.
It takes 15 minutes.
Yeah, we'll find you. That's kind of recreational. But what kills me is that, I think Kurt Vonnegut wrote about it beautifully in a lot of his books, right? Where he in one of his books, maybe Slaughterhouse 5, the point was he had gone in the story, in his novels, he, as the character, had gone to see an old army buddy. They'd been through Dresden together, which Kurt Vonnegut actually had lived through the Dresden firebombing as a prisoner of war. And when he got to the guy's house, and now they were in their 50s, and his friend's wife, fictional but real, was being really, really rude to him. And he expected to show up and sit by the fire and sip whiskey and talk. And she's like giving them a rickety table in the kitchen and like plonking glasses down. And she got really angry and said, you were all going to talk about this as if you were men who made a choice. You were children who were sent overseas to do really dangerous, horrible things. And lots of people died and you lost a lot of friends. And I don't want you telling the story as if you were men making a choice. That was her kind of the point Kurt made of his experience in the military. And I see it from a different perspective where, since we have an all volunteer military, especially deal with a lot of special operations veterans, my overwhelming feeling, and I'm delighted to help raise money for them and support them and their families and everything that they went through, is that no 18 or 20-year-old gung-ho patriot, athletic, able to pass the rigors of combat control, SEALs, whatever, Green Beret, they have no idea what they're going to be asked to do, and they have no idea what they're going to be asked to see. And no one can, right? And you know this. I mean, this is some of the studies done by Tversky and others. You get 100 men who go through the exact same experience. 70 brush it off, 10 are a little bothered, 15 go to the VA once a month, and 5 commit suicide, whatever the number is. And there's no predictability from that. Balancing all that, we still constantly have a military. We have very, very aggressive interventionist commanders-in-chief who send dominantly young men, especially with special operations, off to do things that are startling and horrible. How much of that imbalance do you think is worth it? Is that even a question that's worth asking?
Wow. I honestly don't have an answer for you. I think that's a constant struggle. It really is, because it's so easy to be idealistic before you actually get on the plane and head out. And sometimes you're doing God's work, and sometimes you're laying in your bunk asking yourself, "What in the world am I doing here?" That's a good question. Yeah. I will say that there are a lot of former Special Forces guys, retired Green Berets and Navy SEALs and Army Rangers, that end up at the CIA. Not because they're intellectuals, thinking the big thoughts and writing, supporting policy positions, but because they're trained killers. And the CIA, 20-something years, 24 years after 9/11, and we still need a staff of competent killers, without any real thought as to what happens to them after the killing's finished. I know a lot of special operations guys at the agency, a lot of them that are my age and that have, either retired or decided they didn't want to stay on as contractors, and they're seriously damaged, these guys. I mean, PTSD is not just real and severe, but it's quite common. And nobody wants to talk about that.
It's one of the things I just said, not to interrupt you at all, but this is a comment that was made, which I've adopted. It came from, who's that great actor? Gary Sinise.
Oh, yeah, so he's great. He does a lot of...
He plays the VA Lieutenant Dan Band.
Yes.
And he makes the comment, I just say PTS. There's no disorder about it. If you go through what these people go through, it's normal.
He's right.
This is not, if you don't, you're a psychopath. If you go through that and you're not disturbed, there's a problem with you.
Mm-hmm. And there's a newly recognized psychiatric diagnosis now called moral injury. It's people who just simply can't live with the memories of some of the things that they've done. And it sort of piggybacks on PTSD.
I can believe it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it is, when you look at and I bring it up, because I see a lot of friends and colleagues who go through it. I see the impact on their families, which can be devastating. And when you balance out all the true costs of the military, it is incredibly important to carry that whole ledger, right? When the military is done with you, aside from some gesticulations of the VA, they're done with you.
Yes.
And that is, there's nothing new in that, right? Picasso made great paintings about the Spanish soldiers, right? There's nothing new in this. And I don't know, I've said this for years, and I've got a lot of friends who agree, the age of the military, you shouldn't be allowed to enlist until you're 35 and you've got a family. That, in my opinion, right? Because it's just, you've got a different view of the world.
Yes.
Very different view of the world. And I think that thing about moral injury, right? I think by the time you hit 40, I think you've got a solid sense of what you personally are willing to do in defense of your country.
Sure.
And I think a lot of the young men at 18, 19, 20, They're not formed. Their brains
They're not
haven't finished
formed.
forming by 25.
They're not formed.
They're not formed.
And they're more
And we're
gung-ho
pointing
than they
them a
ever will be in
direction.
the future.
Ever will be in the future. And for whatever reason, your story really resonated with me about that, because I've just seen so much of that damage that is done. And although I never joined the agency and never worked, when I graduated college, it's funny, I went and spoke to military recruiters. Never forget it. Both Navy and Army both said to me, "War's over. We won." It was 93. It's over. The Cold War's over. There's no career here. We're done. My last thing I do before I talk to you is clear out my desk, right? So it was fascinating. And then, surviving September 11th, clearly we're not done. But it was interesting because I always laughed. A lot of my friends who did serve, it was a few years to either side. It was either 87, 88, to still Berlin Wall hasn't fallen yet. There's still conflict. There's still real issues. And then, of course, after September 2001, that became a whole different world. But that brief period of fake peace for a decade. A lot of ground was lost.
Fake peace and a lot of really bad policy decisions.
A lot of horrible policy decisions, right? Because my world is global capital markets and commodities. And so I wrote a book about the federal budget, which came out April 2024, which makes, by the way, Elon's approach to the government look like he's a soft left-wing big government liberal. So I've got a very sharp vision of the knife that should happen to the federal budget. But a lot of things, those mistakes that were made, all the wishful thinking, right? Clinton let the Chinese into the World Trade Organization on the hope that if they get rich, they'll turn nice and democratic.
Right.
Well, no.
That's what NAFTA was based on.
I give them credit. They never said that.
Yeah,
they never claimed they do that.
That's right. And that's also what NAFTA was based on. He walked away from the unions just to appease the Mexicans and the Canadians, and hope that the Mexicans would stay in Mexico if they had more factories.
Yeah, and they, as we're seeing now, watch the president of Mexico screaming and yelling over this insanity. Like, no one ever wants to address the real problem, which is you're on the same continent we are, with this pretty much the same starting date. Why does your economy suck, and why are you poor? That's a cultural issue.
Let me add something.
Right?
Let me add something. Talk about a cultural issue.
Cultural issue.
Yeah, talk about a cultural issue. Yeah. In 1964, South Korea and Pakistan had the same GDP. The same.
Right. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And
a lot of bad decisions were made.
A lot of bad decisions, and a lot of one of the greatest things I discovered about the South Koreans, I love working with them. They're very, generically speaking, I've dealt with a lot of Japanese businesses, a lot of South Korean. And what I love about the Koreans is they're insanely viciously hardworking and hyper competitive, but they don't lie and they don't cheat. Right? They'll argue a point forever and debate a price forever and negotiate a contract forever, but they mean it. Once they shake hands, they mean it, right? Which is kind of easy to deal with, right? As a New Yorker, that's how we live in the world, right? And one of the things I found fascinating when they were looking to reconstruct and build their country after the war, they looked around the world and said, objectively, we want to look for cultural markers of success. What are the factors that go into a society thriving and succeeding? And what they settled on was the Jewish diaspora. And they said, here's someone that is persecuted beyond belief. Everyone hates them. And wherever they go, where they're hated, they do well. Like, what's the secret sauce? Do I need to learn Hebrew? What are they doing? And so they translated the Talmud. I don't know if you know what the Talmud is.
Yeah, sure.
It's
the Jewish holy book.
Torah. The Talmud is, so the Talmud is described as the operating manual for the Torah. Right, so you got the Torah, which is the written law, and the Talmud is the operating manual about how you use the
analysis and implementation.
So, analysis, explication, what does it really mean? All that, right? So angels on the head of the pin kind of thing. and they translated the Talmud into Korean because they looked at the reasoning process and the argumentative process and the rhetorical dialectical process that rabbinical students went through, and that so many people who study Talmud go on to great success in other fields, and they figured that's it. Whatever they're doing, we're not going to believe in their God, whatever the hell that is. So, some did. They became a lot of Christianity in Korea. But I found that fascinating, that they took a very deliberate view that this is how we're going to crack this nut. And they have been wildly successful using the Talmud as their operating manual. I love that.
What a crazy story that is.
Isn't that great? But it's especially as, I think it happens to all of us, right? I've gotten older. I've got kids now, right? I look at the world very, very differently than when I was 19. Obviously, I hope so. Otherwise, I'd be an idiot, right? And every time we get into some new foreign adventure, every time all I can think of is, if there's a single young American that's lost and this wasn't worth doing, we shouldn't be there. And I don't know how we make those judgments. I've never sat in that seat. I've never had to make the judgment, so I can't pretend to be a Monday morning quarterback. But I think it's incumbent upon all thoughtful Americans who vote for the policies and vote for the people that make these decisions to think about it. Which, again, what I was so fascinated by your experience. You were you aim at the CIA, or were you?
Oh yeah.
Were you recruited while you were in school?
I was recruited.
Yeah, this is what you wanted to do.
Well, I told my parents when I was 9 that I wanted to be a spy when I grew up. And they thought that was kind of funny. And they bought me walkie-talkies for Christmas that year. And my mom bought me a little bottle of disappearing ink and stuff. They thought I was just a little kid. But then when I was 16,
that's awesome.
When I was 16, I told my dad specifically that I wanted to be a spy in the Middle East. And he said, "Oh my God, You haven't outgrown this?" And I said, No, I want to be a spy. So I got a bachelor's degree in Middle Eastern Studies. And then I got a master's degree in legislative affairs with a concentration in policy analysis, thinking if I can't get into the CIA, maybe I'll go to Capitol Hill or I'll go into the Foreign Service. And then sure enough, my grad school advisor was actually a CIA officer undercover as a professor, and he recruited me into the CIA. So
that's great.
It was a match from early on.
It's a good match. I find it hilarious because I got out of Chicago with a degree in anthropology, Islamic history, and Arabic, and then I did a lot of Sharia finance. I've worked in the Gulf. Right, my biggest concern for years has been that people thought I was in the agency.
Oh, without a doubt.
But it wasn't. No. Right, so that's really bad. Right, like just being American and Saudi to have someone thinking, "Hey, you're really with them." Like, no, I'm really no. Like there's no backup if you decide to grab me.
I was at a Rotary luncheon once in Bahrain. And I was sitting at a table with all Bahraini businessmen. And one of them says to me, look at this over here. And he points at another table, but it's the ambassador, the deputy chief of mission, and the political officer, all three of whom were legitimate State Department officers. And he says, CIA. Right. You know how I can tell? I said, no, Khalid, how can you tell?
Oh.
He says, they always sit together and they don't speak Arabic. He said, you're the only one I trust because you speak Arabic. I said, Alhamdulillah. I studied hard.
Alhamdulillah. That's interesting because especially in Saudi, where I was there a lot during they were grabbing people. And I never spoke English in public. I never went to the compounds. I never went to the malls. I always stayed in like middle of the road Saudi businessman hotels.
Yes.
Tried to blend in and keep to myself. I didn't want to draw any attention because luckily I was there with clients who predominantly ferried me around with drivers. That was okay.
Good.
But that's funny. So that's great. So they were looking at the State Department employees, and his logic is fascinating. So he wouldn't have occurred to him that the one who bothered to learn Arabic would actually be the spy. That's fascinating logic. Wrong, but that's fascinating logic.
He assumed an arrogance from the CIA that would preclude language study, which I was fascinated by. Like in his mind,
that is fascinating.
We talked about it later, and in his mind, he had no idea I was CIA, but he really believed that the CIA was like so busy and so gung-ho. They don't have time for languages. They just send you right out and you start recruiting spies. I was like, oh,
That's
okay.
fascinating.
And I'll tell you another thing, too.
How are you supposed to recruit them?
I know, right? There was another thing, too. The political officer, who was a close friend of mine, he cycled out after my first year there, and he was replaced by a woman who was twice our age, but who had never served in the Middle East before. And so the Bahrainis, I think, suspected that I was CIA, because every once in a while something odd would happen. But I was really, really good at surveillance and surveillance detection. I became a surveillance detection instructor at the agency after I went back after 9/11. And this woman had served in Romania during communism, and then she was at State Department during the fall of the wall. So her career was a Cold War era career. So she had never been trained in surveillance or surveillance detection. So what she would do is, if she thought she was being followed, she would just drive like a bat out of hell, 80 miles an hour, through the city. And
you said, who would keep up?
She would have like a whole train of surveillance on her. And then she would come to the office and brag about it the next day. And I never said anything. But I said to a colleague, I said, thank God, man, because they are convinced that she's agency, and they have pulled all the surveillance off of me. And so I was good with that. Mm-hmm.
I've got a question for you. It just occurred to me. I remember because, again, after the Islamo fascists tried to kill me for the fourth time, I'd do so much work overseas. I'd always interfaced. I don't even know what they call them in the agency, but there's always someone who's collecting information from business folks.
Oh, right? Natural Resources.
And so
Division.
I had. Yeah. So I had two of them. They passed on now. They were in-laws of mine, so I knew them. One of them was chief of station in Australia for years. So I knew who to call. I said, if I can be helpful, let me know. And it was fascinating. One of the questions they actually asked me to help out with, this was in like October 2001, which again I found fascinating in terms of national security. So we just had planes fly into the buildings, right? I get on Amtrak. No one checks me. I could have carried 40 pounds of Semtex onto the train. There's no rational security. Nothing changed anyway. But it was in D.C., and the question she was asking is, she was a Russian specialist, and they were panicking about finding linguistic specialists who would understand the languages of the tribal areas in Afghanistan. But the vetting process is so extreme, like no one's going to pass this test, right? From the traditional way of, do you have family still there, all that sort of stuff. And I remember I suggested, you've got to do kind of what we do with risk management on Wall Street, which is, why don't you take a given text you need translated, right? Break it up into 10 pieces, give each piece to 5 different people. You don't have to trust them. See what their responses are, see what their translation is. They'll never get the full picture, which is your concern, right? You never want to give the full picture to anyone you don't trust. And just do that while you're trying to find someone that you can trust. And I was always fascinated because I never got any feedback. And I never knew if that was actually adopted as an idea. Did that ever come up in your experience? It was a way of
no, the only
getting translations out of people you don't trust?
No. They had people who had been naturalized, but who were originally from these tribal areas, and gave them yellow badges, which allowed them information up to the secret level. But anything above secret had to come from NSA. So, for example, all of my language teachers had yellow badges rather than the blue fully cleared badge or the green fully cleared contractor badge. They were CIA employees, but cleared only up to secret. And we had a lot of them. And they were constantly hiring people. Oftentimes, they would hire people from state. Like, people would serve as a translator in the American embassy in, Timbuktu someplace. And then they would come back in retirement, and the CIA would hire them out of retirement. My boss from Bahrain and one of my best friends, just a normal white guy from Minnesota, and he was married to a Pakistani woman who was from one of the most important families in Pakistan. They had 3 boys, Harvard, Yale, and West Point. I mean, this is a real American success story family. The wife never worked outside the home. And the husband finally retired from the Foreign Service. They moved back here to the DC area. She was in a hairdresser's one day, and an FBI agent walked into the hairdresser's, showed her his badge, and says, "Your country needs you." She thought it was a joke, but she ended up, they hired her as a GS-15, and she was the head of the South Asian Languages Division at FBI. Oh. Yeah. So that's how they ended up doing it. She was there 10 years.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's got to be a constant. Just very quickly, I remember one of the guys, a friend of mine in New York, was Persian, but he was born here, right? Mm-hmm. His family fled after the Shah.
Right.
And he looked very Persian. But especially when Ahmadinejad was president, it would come to New York.
Yeah, for UNGA.
The NYPD was in charge of security, and they always put him on the team, and he never spoke. I mean, I imagine they were more circumspect, but his whole job was to just listen and come back, and he especially like going out with them when they want to go out at night and drink. Right? That was they definitely put him on that security detail to see how much these idiots would slip up. Anyway, that is the linguistic thing is a fascinating thing. I know that you've got limited time. What is sort of there may not be, is there some sort of generic message you've got based on, hardworking patriot, served his country, did the right thing, got arguably, I would say, got screwed by his government.
Thank you.
For doing the right thing. I mean, what do you say to people about what the average American voter should understand and pay attention to and demand of elected officials, such that in the ideal case, your experience will never be replicated by another American?
Number one, we are not being served well by our elected officials. And I don't care what party you subscribe to, they're both terrible. And they're both liars.
Well, you come to the right place for that, Jack.
They're both liars, and they're both self-serving. Number one. Number two, we are a nation of laws. So we're either going to be that shining beacon, that shining city on a hill that Ronald Reagan talked about, or we're not. We're either going to be the country that writes an annual civil rights report on every country in the world with which we have diplomatic relations, or we're not. But we can't order other countries to do this, that, and the other thing and claim the moral high ground when we do exactly the same things that our greatest enemies are doing on a day-to-day basis. So, listen, it doesn't make any difference if you consider yourself right-wing or left-wing or maybe a former Democrat or a former Republican. The issue is that they work for us, and we know what the rules are. They're delineated for us in the Constitution, and we have to demand that our elected officials respect the Constitution. It comes down as simply as that. Before we started filming, you and I were talking about the fact that there hasn't been a congressional declaration of war since the day after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So quite literally, every armed conflict that we have fought since then has been illegal and has been an impeachable offense. Nobody cares.
Yep.
Everybody should care, but we should all be on the lookout for this.
I thank you for that, because I write about the political class, in all caps, who have immunized themselves from accountability by doing two things simultaneously: making the operations of government insanely boring and insanely complicated. So you screen out most people with the first because people are busy. They're living their lives, right? And the time they get any downtime and they're not coaching a Little League game, they want to watch a football game and drink a beer. Who could argue, right? Who's got the time to dive into the machinations of what your government officials are doing? And then when you do dive in, they make it insanely complicated and hard to understand, which wipes away the interest of another half, right? So you've got like a few of us who have the bandwidth and the, I don't know, compulsive nerdiness to want to figure it out and end it. But, and that was, I'm not here to pump my book, but that's what I wrote the book about was, I always say to younger employees, don't bring me a complaint unless you also give thought to a solution. And so
you can't write it
I found myself bitching about the government. I was like, yeah. So I spent 15 years reading all the budgets, and then came up with one. People can like it, cannot like it, whatever, but at least there was a thought behind it. And the goal at the end was, with the help of a lot of people who read versions, was I didn't need to create one more thing that like the scholars would like, because who cares?
Sure.
I didn't need to create one more partisan book. So one party loves it and they get really angry, and then the other party ignores it, right? It was really designed to say, here's how your government functions. Here's how much they spend. Mm-hmm. I think they shouldn't here, there, but like, here it is. Mm-hmm. And when I wrote that, I published it, I didn't realize I was writing a unicorn. There's no other book in the federal budget which tells you enough about how Washington works that officials leave D.C. A lot of them write very excellent books about why Health and Human Services doesn't work, why the Department of Education sucks, why whatever. But none of them were complete enough to do something about it. And so what I found fascinating, and why I ask guests, like, what would you suggest? And everyone asks me, well, what would you want? Well, if you change one thing, and all I'd say is I want every American to dedicate 2 hours a month to understanding what the clowns in D.C. are doing. Mm-hmm. If everyone just paid attention, then we'd be better off. My favorite journalist was right after Obamacare was passed, and Congress, of course, tried to exclude themselves from this wonderful bill. Right. It's so great. It's so great. We don't want to have it. We want you to have it, but we don't want it, right? He made sure for 8 years to listen for every single press release, and it was always like Friday at 4:30 p.m. before a long weekend, where they would come and say, we're going to propose another carve-out, and he'd be there, and he'd ask questions, and he'd write about it, and they'd scurry back and hide it, right? Congress spent 8 years trying to exempt themselves from Obamacare, and finally they succeeded. So I think he retired from the post wherever he was. But it's largely what this podcast is created about. I'm not a podcaster, I'm a banker, right? It was just, I would like people to pay a little bit of attention. And if they did, I think we'd be better off.
I think so too.
That might be a dream. That's all I ask. As you say, it's in some ways it's not that complicated. This Constitution is fairly deep and complex, but it's fairly simple in certain ways. And I remember that because there's recent kerfuffle. I lived in South Africa right at the fall of apartheid and was there for the Rainbow Nation and bumped into Mandela in Parliament. And because it was there, this weird spot, and my goddaughter's father was a member of Parliament, I actually accidentally was sitting in a drafting session of the Constitution for South Africa. And they were asking me, just as a random American, like, what do you think of your Constitution? What's in it? I'm not a lawyer. I'm not anything special. I'm an American. And it was fascinating because they went overboard with this insanely complicated structure, which has failed them clearly. But they still held this reverence for the idea that America, as a shining beacon on a hill of rule of law, people doing the right thing, and I think we can get there. I don't know how we change the perception. We've got riots in Los Angeles right now because the federal government's enforcing the law. I don't know where we are as a nation. I don't know if we're more fractured than we were on the morning of September 12th, 2001. And I don't know if there are people who want that to happen. Right? Who would like to see a further fracturing. I don't know. I don't know a real answer for it. But your thoughts are invaluable in terms of just someone who chose, this is great. I love the fact that 9, you wanted to be a spy. Yeah. He chose the right languages. You went and were working in your field, and then in some hilarious way, one of the people in the culture you were surveilling thought, well, you certainly can't be a spy because you wouldn't have bothered to learn Arabic. I think that is one of the most fascinating things I've heard in ages.
Jeez.
I love that. But anyway, what are your final thoughts? I know you've got a little bit of time. What are the things that are
keep up the
on
fight?
your mind?
Keep up the fight, whether it's in the the voting booth or on the op-ed pages or in the streets with a sign or emailing or calling your elected official. We can't give these guys 1 inch. They work for us, and we have to keep fighting.
They work for us, and they have to be told that. And I do because at heart, I'm still a 13-year-old boy.
Right.
I love telling people that the function, when you go to the congress.gov or the House of Representatives, the search function is find your member.
Yeah, there it is.
I'm sorry, it's juvenile. Every time I tell people I laugh, but at least it's memorable, right? They work for you. You can go talk to them. You can go to the Rayburn building. You can walk through security and go knock on that door.
Yes, you can.
What are you doing? How are you voting?
That's it.
And they should.
That's right.
And they should. John, I thank you so much for taking the time to come on.
Thank you.
I recommend certainly having read some of your stuff. It's great. You're an excellent writer.
Thanks so much.
And it's important what you've done. I really appreciate your not receding into the shadows as many people who've been through the ringer. Right. Good. Excellent. That's what the nation needs more of. I will let you go. We look forward to speaking soon. And for my listeners, you don't need reminding to turn off the mainstream media who are lying to you and tune into Messy Times.